Our second macromolecule is lipids. This has long-term energy storage and it's very concentrated when we're talking about the energy. Lipids are also made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates, but because their structure is different, their function is also different. They have long hydrocarbon chains, which means HC here. So whenever you see a long chain of hydrogens and carbons, just like we see in this illustration right here, we call it a hydrocarbon chain. We can also divide the lipids into what we call family groups. We're going to take a look at fats, phospholipids, and steroids. Lipids do not form polymers. In our carbohydrate lesson, we talked about long chains of glucose molecules creating cellulose, starch, glycogen. Lipids do not form polymers. We still have big molecules, but they're made of smaller subunits, and we do not have a continuing chain like we saw in the carbohydrates. If we start with fats, their structure, it's made up of a glycerol molecule. You can see that right here. Glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule and 1 fatty acid molecule here. Again, we're going to use dehydration synthesis, which means they're going to remove a water molecule when those two molecules combine with one another. Again, the fatty acid tail is very long. It has what's called a carboxyl group or a COOH group right here. That's just additional information. You will not be tested on that. We do require an enzyme. We're going to talk more about enzymes later. Enzymes are a catalyst, a type of protein, which increases the chemical reaction. When we combine molecules, even in carbohydrates, we do require an enzyme to take care of that process. And then there's our water molecule that gets released at the same time. Triglycerides, you may be familiar with that term. These are 3 fatty acids linked to 1 glycerol molecule. So again, here's our glycerol molecule. Only this time then we have 1, 2, 3 fatty acids attached to that. And again, we do use that dehydration synthesis 3 times. We remove 3 different water molecules. Fats have the ability to store energy simply because of that long hydrocarbon chain. Is this hydrocarbon chain polar or not polar, this chain? Now, we haven't talked about polar versus nonpolar. If you took chemistry, those should be familiar for you. Polar would be like a water molecule. A water molecule, if this is my oxygen, again, I apologize, I don't have my tablet with me here today. But if this is our water molecule here, here's our oxygen, here's our positively charged hydrogens here. It's because they have an uneven distribution of charge, which means a water molecule has a positive charge on one end and a negative charge on the other end. It's considered polar. If it's nonpolar, it means that there is not an uneven distribution of charge. And so for our lipids, this fatty acid is nonpolar. It does not play well with water. It does not dissolve in water. Is our chain hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophilic means that it likes water. Hydrophobic means that it does not or it fears water. And again, fats are hydrophobic. This is why you can't mix oil and water together. Again, they function in energy storage. And that's because we have a very high concentration of those hydrogen and carbons making up that chain. They actually provide twice the amount of energy than carbohydrates do. They can cushion organs. So the organs within your body have a small layer of fat on them. And they can also insulate body like we might see in animals found in the Arctic. Think about whale blubber. We can divide these into 2 categories. Saturated fats, again, all the carbons are bonded to the hydrogens. And there's no carbon to carbon double bonds. In other words, again, I know we haven't talked about this here. Hopefully in chemistry you did. But what that means is these carbon atoms that are connected together. Okay, my thing is not going to work very well here for me today. All of these carbons, these little black circles here in the diagram, those are carbon atoms. There's no double bonds. They're all single bonds between one another. So that's why they're straight like that. A long straight chain. These are animal fats. They're solid at room temperature, like your butter or margarine. And these tend to contribute to cardiovascular disease because this is where we find some of those plaque deposits. Unsaturated fats, the carbon to carbon bonds are double bonds. And so what that means, if you take a look up here, you can see a kink or a bend in the fatty acid chain here. That's because there is a double bond between those carbons, and so it tends to make a bend or a kink. Unsaturated fats are plant and fish fats. Vegetable oils would fall into this category, like olive oil, sunflower oil, peanut oil. They're liquid at room temperature. And again, the kinks made by double bonded carbons prevent the molecules from packing tightly together, and that's why they're a liquid at room temperature. Here we have this little penguin, says monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. Monounsaturated just means there's a single bend or kink. Polyunsaturated means that there's several bends or kinks. There is studies out there that suggest that if you ingest polyunsaturated fats, it's much better for you than, say, monounsaturated fat. So when we're talking about saturated versus unsaturated, you should try to avoid ingesting lots of saturated fats. And if you do need to ingest oils, unsaturated is your best bet. Phospholipids is a type of lipid. It's made up of a glycerol and two fatty acid chains. So again, here's our glycerol molecule, and here's our two fatty acid chains. It has a PO4 group. Oops, here, it's negatively charged, again, just FYI. Is our phospholipid hydrophobic or hydrophilic? Well, it has two parts. And when we talk more in detail on the cell membrane, I'll get to more details here with that. The fatty acid chains are hydrophobic, which means they don't like water. The phosphate head is hydrophilic, which means it does like water. So it kind of has a split personality. If we were to put phospholipids into water all by themselves, again, the hydrophilic heads love to be next to water, and so it's going to face outward towards the water, and the hydrophobic tails hide from water. And so what happens is if we were to drop a bunch of phospholipids into, say, a container of water, they would assemble into these little bubbles, these micelles here. And as you can see, all the heads are facing outward towards water, and all the tails are facing inward away from water. And it can also form a phospholipid bilayer that we see in our cell membrane. Why is this important? Phospholipids create a barrier in the water, so we have a definite outside versus inside. When we get back into class, I'm going to show you a video about how soap works with our water molecules and our phospholipids. Phospholipids make our cell membranes. Steroids are a lipid. They are made up of 4 fused carbon rings, plus then I have a question mark there because what's attached to that differs depending on what type of steroid we're talking about. Different steroids created by attaching different functional groups to these rings. And so again, a different structure means a different function. So again, here is these 4 fused carbon rings. And then what is attached to them, say like up here, is different depending on what steroid we're talking about. An example would be cholesterol, which we see in this illustration here, and sex hormones. Cholesterol is an important cell component. It's found in animal cells. It's a precursor of all other steroids. In other words, we have this part of the steroid and then we add on to that. High levels of cholesterol, however, may contribute to cardiovascular disease. And again, down there is the picture of cholesterol and then just a picture of showing how it can start blocking up your arteries. Again, cholesterol helps keep cell membranes fluid and flexible. More details on that at a later time. So if we go from cholesterol to sex hormones, again, what you'll notice here, here's our cholesterol backbone, basically our 4 fused carbon rings. And all we have to do is take a look at the functional groups. So there we have cortisol versus aldosterone, different types of hormones. When it says it's made in the adrenal cortex, the adrenals are found on top of your kidneys, just an FYI. And then down here for our hormones here, testosterone, you can see we have an oxygen as a functional group here. Estrogen has an OH group. And then progesterone, we have a CH3, and then the carbon and oxygen functional group there. So again, we have the same backbone, but different functional groups. Any questions? Make sure to write those down. I will answer those when we get back into class.